In 2007, the most dangerous city in the U.S. was Camden, New Jersey. 4 years later, the murder rate was down 40%. That's 37 lives saved. Why? Because the world of law enforcement met the world of data. That's up next on the Q Factor. When we think about why this era of big data is upon us, we usually think about computers, better technology, creating more and more numbers. But out in front of every line of code is a human being, blazing a trail. It's only after a person shines a light into some previously dark corner of the world that the flow of data can begin. We're lucky enough to have such a trailblazer on the Q Factor today. Her name is Anne Milgram. Anne's frontier is the world of crime, and she's not just theorizing about what crime might be. She's out on the front lines, working with police and prosecutors to make the world a safer place. As Attorney General for the state of New Jersey, Anne helped bring statistical analysis to New Jersey's criminal justice system. And in so doing, she drastically lowered the crime rate in one of America's most dangerous cities. As Anne puts it, she's using data to help create Moneyball for criminal justice. There simply aren't many more important applications of quantitative thinking. Here's my conversation with Anne Milgram. Anne, thanks so much for coming on the Q Factor.
Thanks for having me.
It's really terrific. Thank you. So I gather you weren't always a data junkie?
That's an understatement, I think. Yeah, I don't even think I'd heard the word data until I was pretty far advanced in my life. When I became AG, on day one, I was in charge of Camden, the police department for Camden, New Jersey. And Camden is a city in the southern part of New Jersey. It's 80,000 people. It's historically struggled with a fair amount of poverty and inequality. And when I became AG, a prior AG had taken over the police department because it had consistently been ranked as the most dangerous city in America. And there had been corruption within the department. I mean, it was really just an unthinkably dangerous place. And so I had no idea what I was doing in policing. I come from a long line of police officers in South Amboy, New Jersey, but I'd never, ever I'd worked closely with officers and agents, FBI agents and other agents, but I'd never policed. And so one of the things I did when I went in, and being AG, I should step back and say, this is the first time in my entire career that I got a view of the system as a whole. And I thought I would get a lot of information about what are we doing? Who are we prosecuting? Who comes back into the system? Why do people commit new crimes? What do we do with kids who are committing crimes, but we know that they can be rehabilitated or we think that they can be? How does that work? And basically, I got nothing.
So you're crying out saying, I need to see some data. I want to better understand these choices that are being made. Back at that time in Camden, which, obviously was one of the most dangerous cities in the U.S. Tell us about some of the experiences you were having there and what really made you reach out for that.
I went down to Camden to see one of their CompStat meetings. I didn't see a single police officer. I drove throughout the street for an entire morning. I didn't see a single police officer. When I later asked where they were, the answer was responding to 911 calls. But what I saw in Camden was essentially senior, really well-meaning officers saying, we had a homicide last week, no suspects, and they would write that on a yellow sticky and they'd put it up on the map of the city in the location where it happened. And then the next officer would say, shooting or robbery, no suspects, and they'd put it up there. And, at the end of 2 hours, you've got all these yellow stickies, and I do love yellow stickies. My husband can attest that I leave them all over our apartment. But, they're not a crime fighting strategy, right? They're not a way to fight crime or to understand what's happening, because I think there were over 11 or 12,000 911s per year at that time. And again, it's a city of 80,000 people. So that's a lot of 911 calls.
Yeah.
And so, we started trying to drill it and figure out, okay, why are there so many 911 calls? And we couldn't get the information out. And I had an amazing guy, Joe Cordero, who had been the police chief in East Orange and the police director. And I finally said, Joe, please just go. Right. And he's a data wizard. And so Joe spent an entire week there, pulled the data himself, and literally came back and said, okay, here's the thing. There are a lot of 911 calls, but there are a lot of repeat 911 calls because the officers are taking too long to show up and they're not showing up when it's not violent crime. And so what you ended up having was people calling repeatedly again and again. And often, because at the time we didn't have GPS on the police cars, we weren't dispatching the closest officer. And so you can imagine, I think Gregg is the closest officer. I sent Gregg. It turns out Gregg has just done work on the other side of town. It takes him 20 minutes to get someplace. And so it was just the whole system had really destroyed itself. And so we put GPS on the cars. We came to understand, we created an automatic dispatch system, and we dropped 911 calls. I mean, I saw one of the officers recently who said at the time that I was there, he did about 20 911 calls a shift, which is a lot of running from response to response. Now he does 3.
Huh.
And if you think about,
that's significant.
It's huge. And what's really huge about it is that I think this is a space where 911 is amazing, but it's incredibly reactive. And so if all you have are police officers running after 911 calls, you're not in the community. You're not doing the kind of policing you need to do to have, people feel safe in their homes and people feel comfortable with policing. You're literally just running from thing to thing. But that's just one example of how just using some data and a little bit of technology and analytics was able to completely transform the amount of time that officers had to actually respond to calls and to be on the street.
I'd imagine once you started looking at this data in ways that no one had thought to look at it before, ex post it's so obvious that makes perfect sense. But at that time, people were not doing this. You started looking at it. You must have started thinking about hundreds of things that could make an impact. How did you decide which things to focus on? The 911 calls are a good example because that made a big impact on so many things. But how did you know what not to spend time on with all this data in front of you?
In a world of limited resources, which we'll always have in policing and prosecution and courts, what do we really care about? And my view is that we really care about violence and we care about things that disrupt the community. And so, there were grandmoms who would tell me, look, my grandson is living here. He can't go to school because there's drag racing in the middle of the street at night. That matters enormously. To me, that is a priority for the police to stop. And the number one priority, of course, is to stop violence. And so, just really shifting to start making the officers focus on the really serious violent crimes as well as things of high concern to the community. That took us 2.5 years.
I think in 2011, you started to work with the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, where I believe you created this pretrial risk assessment tool, which I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about that. And then I'd like to come right back to the 900 risk factors that you identified. And I have questions about how you figured out what not to consider.
If someone is arrested for a crime and they're charged, a judge then decides, and this is what we call pretrial, do you stay in jail while you're waiting for that case to go to trial, which can be years, a year, 2 years. It's unbelievable. It's, the average, I think, is 18 months on a felony case, which is extraordinary. Or should we release you to the community? And the way judges have historically done this is they've set bail. They've picked a number where financially they basically say, if you can pay this amount of money, you can get out. And I don't need to tell you this, but it is deeply unfair.
Oh yeah, I've seen that. I've had experiences through this organization where that exact fact pattern happened, and okay, maybe it's $1,000. These people don't have $1,000, so all of a sudden you're in there for weeks for some minor thing that, I could really relate. It's a very frustrating situation.
So we went out and pulled data. We basically said, okay, we're going to start this. So we started talking to some of the jurisdictions that had risk or had pretrial systems. So even if they weren't using risk tools, some of them were, some weren't, but basically saying to them, okay, can you give us all your data? And we ended up amassing at the Arnold Foundation the largest data set of pretrial information in America.
Wow.
And basically hiring these two fantastic researchers, Marie Van Nostrum and Chris Lowenkamp. Chris had actually built the risk assessment tool for the federal probation system and pretrial system. And Marie had done a lot of work in Virginia and a number of other states around the country. And so what they were able to do with this data set was look at and pull hundreds of factors and basically, and by the way, the reason we also went to Lowenkamp, I should say this, is he'd done a meta-analysis of which factors mattered.
Right.
Meaning, if you look at, in hundreds of factors, what actually tells you whether or not people come back to court. And at the time, most people were using employment, education, things that candidly courts weren't verifying, pretrial service agencies weren't verifying. And so that's how the pretrial agencies were working. And the one question I realize, this is a little bit weedy, but I think it becomes an important data question is that
I usually hang out in the weeds. So
okay, so all right, we'll go full nerd. So basically, the huge cost of the DC system was that you needed people to interview people who are coming through the system, that it costs a lot of money to hire people to conduct those, what we call pretrial interviews. And so there were a number of other problems with those interviews as well, but it was also just an exorbitant cost. And I knew that we would never again be able to spread this nationally if we had to pay that cost. And so the key question at the beginning was, can we eliminate the interview? Is data, administrative data, what you've been arrested for, whether you have prior convictions, whether you failed to come to court, whether this current offense is violent, how old are you at the time of the offense, whether those things could work or whether we actually needed the interview. And we were lucky because the state of Kentucky, which had given us their data and was a tremendous partner, had a risk assessment tool that had a handful, I think 4 questions that were interview-based questions. And I can't remember the exact number, like 9 questions, I think, that were all coming from this data that already existed on people in their criminal histories. And so we ran, okay, what is the risk? What is the risk profile? How predictive is this risk assessment with the administrative data alone or with the interviews? And we found they were essentially equal. Oh. And so once we knew we could eliminate the human interview, that basically told us we could build a tool that could spread nationally. I think data is essential, and I think you need it to understand what's happening. And it really does, in the risk assessment context, I mean, one thing we saw was that if you came in young and your offense was violent, you were much more likely to come back violent. And that's something that a lot of judges just didn't know on their own. Those are 2 factors that judges just would not put together. And so, we consistently found the value of being able to be a lot more predictive at identifying, people who were likely to be violent and people who weren't, and then releasing the people who weren't and detaining those who were. But we really relied very heavily on the fact that the judges still got to decide and that their discretion was incredibly important. So we weren't taking all that subjective gut out of it. We're basically saying you can be better informed and there's some information you should use to ground yourself. And then look, you get to decide and you can override it and do whatever you want.
Sure. I think that makes sense. I mean, you're adding tools to help, what I would think of as an informed human being at the end of the process to make that final decision. I mean, I do wonder if maybe the judges have too much discretion. And that's probably part of it. I also think about, and I know this is, again, probably one of the great challenges is, we want all this data to be neutral and we're studying past data, but,
exactly. Yep.
But is it racially biased to begin with? Or, does it, there's some challenges there that I'm sure you're thinking a lot about.
So I think, I think the data is biased, right? And I think anyone who sits in a room and says that there's, that there isn't bias in the data would not be, telling the full truth of American criminal justice. I also don't think that means we don't use it. I think we have to use it. I mean, what's the alternative? And this to me is incredibly important, which is that we live in a world where, we have the highest incarceration rates in the world. We spend an absolute fortune on putting kids in jails and prisons instead of educating them. And, to me, the system, if we accept that the system is deeply problematic and is not fair, then at that point, and that there's a lot of, I think, implicit bias, but there is a lot of subjective bias that is sort of built in. If we get to that point, then I think the standard has to be, can we improve upon that? And can we reduce that? And can we reduce our rates of incarceration?
The incarceration rate in the U.S. is quite high.
Yes.
I think it's higher than anywhere else in, or most other places in the world. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
And it seems like that's considered a good thing. That more people in prison means we're doing well. I guess crime has dropped dramatically over the last 25 years.
I think it's a bad thing. So this is a slightly complicated question, but I'll try to do it in a pretty succinct way. Which is, first of all, we incarcerate at the highest rate in the world, and so we have 5% of the world's population. We have 25% of the prisoners, and when
Wow.
you just look at the rate, like X number of people per 1,000, how many people are incarcerated per 1,000 people? We're off the charts, and we are off the charts when it comes to our economic peers. If you looked at a graph, and I can send you a graph I show people a lot, the obvious answer that I think a lot of people would have is, okay, well, maybe we have more crime. The truth is, we actually really don't have more crime. We are sort of to the, if you looked at this chart of all of our economic peers, we're kind of sort of to the middle, maybe a little bit to the high end, but there are many countries that have much more violent crime victims than we do. And everybody, even in our sort of area, everybody has dramatically fewer people in prison. And it's because we sort of created a one-size-fits-all system where the answer is essentially jail or prison. And it is just an unbelievable failure, in my opinion. And it's also just a lack of understanding that if we want public safety and less crime in America, we have to do the things that get you there. And that is the proven things: cognitive behavioral therapy, drug treatment. And we do have to hold people accountable. And there are absolutely serious violent crimes for which people should go to jail and prison. But again, if you go back to what I said at the beginning, 70% of all crime is not violent. Detaining people actually makes them more likely to commit crime. So you have to be really thoughtful about what works and what doesn't work. And our rates of recidivism are 65% of the people come back into the criminal justice system after 3 years, over 70%, almost 75% over 5 years. And so what we know is that if you care about public safety, jail and prison, it's not going to make people commit less crime. What we know is that generally people commit more. And so how we use incarceration, to me, should be a really spare resource that we use when it's necessary. And in my view, for public safety reasons, because we think that someone poses a risk to public safety. And I do think that there are people who will be incarcerated and would be incarcerated. But, I would sort of, if you took a snapshot of any jail or prison in America, you would find a lot of people there who could be safely held accountable in communities. And, to me, it really does come down to this priority question of, like, do we want public safety in communities, or do we want, what do we want? And if we want public safety, then we have to think really differently than we think now about just being able to say, look, we put somebody in jail and prison so we're safer, when the truth is we now know we're actually not safer in many instances.
It sounded like you came to these 900 factors. How did you figure out, give us an example, if you could, of maybe five of them or three of them or even one of them that you said, well, that one is not something we're going to consider. Doesn't look like that is helping us make better decisions would help us make better decisions going forward.
There are a couple I could give you. One is just these questions of education and employment. We did not find them to be highly influential. So it's something judges have long relied on. Well, if you have a job, I should let you out. Not having a job doesn't mean you're going to go out and commit crime. And so, judges, I think, were correlating it very heavily in a way that we just didn't find existed. Now, one factor that I think is pretty interesting, but if you actually looked and you sort of did a snapshot of the criminal justice system in America, and you just asked me the question of, like, what are, tell me the majority of crimes in America, like, what are the top one or two crimes? You basically find drug possession. Let me give you three: drug possession, petty theft, and traffic and car infractions. And so drugs is one thing we looked at. Okay, having a prior conviction, it probably means you have an addiction or substance abuse problem. It may mean that. And oftentimes people who have addictions, they do reoffend, right? I mean, there's sort of, we see a lot of recidivism among people who have behavioral health problems, mental illness, substance abuse, homelessness. And I would argue we don't address those well, which is some of the work I've been doing recently. But it's really one of those things where we thought, okay, is it predictive? And the reality was that it actually was predictive of future crime if you had a prior drug conviction, but it did not improve the overall effectiveness of the tool. And so we didn't use it. And so that's sort of, there were factors we found they weren't helpful. People thought they were, but they weren't. There were some that people thought were helpful, which was sort of, if we couldn't gather those other 9 factors, we might have wanted to use it to help our predictive analytics, but we didn't need it. And then the things that ended up in the tool that ended up being really, valuable were prior convictions. And I should note that we intentionally did not use arrest because we think, in terms of a world of disproportionate minority contact with law enforcement, it just felt deeply unfair to us. And we did not lose much on predictive analytics to lose that. We were very comfortable making a decision that it wasn't the right thing to include. Violence turned out to be relevant. The current offense being violent turned out to be most relevant, particularly when you had a young person, but also is relevant generally to future violence. Not coming to court. If one of the things we were looking at predicting for courts was how likely is it somebody's not going to return. One of the things that was interesting about that is that it matters a huge amount within the past 2 years. It matters less within the last 10 years. And once you get beyond 10 years, it really is not predictive.
Wow.
And so, that's probably the best example. It took me 5 minutes of explaining to get there.
No, it's great.
But probably the best example is think about a judge that sees, you missed, a DA who stands up and says, this guy's missed court, 10 times, but you look at it and he's missed court once in the past 10 years and, 9 times before that. It turns out that those 9 times don't really matter.
Huh, that's interesting. But I could see how, without having analyzed that and know that as a fact historically and statistically, you would assume by default that it would matter.
I think so. And I think also judges do consider arrest for what it's worth. I mean, when you look at someone's rap sheet, you've got, almost the way I sometimes thought about this when I talked to judges about it was you've got, the symbol of American criminal justice. It is not a data platform. It is a stack of Redwell folders and manila folders. Like this is, case by case, we've got them. So you've got a stack of those on a judge's desk and you've got, 10 pages of criminal history, arrests, convictions, not showing up at court. And the judge is leafing through those. And what the tool really did instead was say, okay, how many prior convictions this person has? Here's how many prior convictions for violence. Here's how many times they failed to go back to court. And here's, given that, how we would score them in their risk of likelihood to commit a new crime, come back to court, or violence. And again, the violence was just a flag of whether someone was elevated at a risk of violence. And again, the judge then has to look at all the facts of the case and decide, what do I think?
Right.
Can I give you one example of why I think the
Please.
work is important? I think the best story about the work is actually the great state of New Jersey, my home state, who took the risk assessment tool, but they didn't just take it as a tool. They decided to completely reform their pretrial system. And so they built an entirely new system. They created a right to preventatively detain, which is to incarcerate someone prior to trial if they believe someone is dangerous and could not be safely monitored outside. But everybody else, they basically said, we want to release you. And if the prosecutor wants you detained, we have to have a hearing very quickly with the public defender or defense lawyer. They did a 360. No other state in America has done this. And they have virtually eliminated bail. And they have also statewide reduced detention by over, I think it's 38% right now.
How many years has this been happening for now?
This has been, that's been, maybe 3.
Wow, that's great.
Maybe 3 years. It's extraordinary.
It must be really exciting for you to see some evidence of the work you did and watch the results.
Well, they really did an amazing job thinking about how do you change. And candidly, they were a state that had a lot of low risk people who were incarcerated. And they also, one of the things I love about the work they're doing is they're checking all the questions of racial bias and making sure, is the tool disproportionately impacting anyone, men, women, minorities. And so they're as thoughtful and as rigorous as anyone could be. And they're the first state to eliminate bail, which I think is an extraordinarily amazing and important thing.
I don't know if you could, give some of our listeners, if you had one that came to mind, perhaps a real life example of when the use of this data saved an actual person, helped them in some way, or maybe an example of when it failed someone. Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, sure. So, I think, NPR has done a number of stories about bail reform in New Jersey. And there are countless stories, and I don't remember the individuals' names, but there are countless stories of people being detained for months at a time on low-level offenses, things like drug possession or petty theft, who lost kids, they lost homes, they were not able to pay court costs, and essentially just, I mean, it has a devastating impact, not just on people's lives, but also on their families' lives. And so, there are many examples of people who, previously would have been detained and are no longer detained. At the other end, look, and I want to be really thoughtful about how I say this, but courts let people out all the time who commit violent crimes. And I'll give you one example of a major US city that I will not call out by name, where we ran their data and we looked both at, they were detaining a lot of low risk folks, people who had committed low level crimes, were very unlikely to reoffend. They had those folks in jail. And then when it came to the high risk folks, half of the high risk folks, the people who we identified as being most dangerous, most likely to commit a violent act, were released. And that was about 250, 300 people that were released. That's as scary. A result of it's scary. And it ultimately led to more than 100 violent crimes.
Wow.
Within a pretty short period of time. And so there are countless examples in the existing system where it happens. Now, I would love to sit here and tell you that something like a tool wouldn't lead to people being ever released, but there are two things to consider. First of all, it's really not just a tool, it's a judge, and the judge uses their discretion of whether or not the recommendations are right. And the tool doesn't give you the answer. It gives you the sort of, okay, this person looks high risk. And then the question is, are there ways in which you could manage that risk in a community? With the preference being that, incarceration, we did studies when I was at Arnold that show, as a rule, particularly among low and moderate risk people, when you incarcerate them for more than 24 hours, you have more crime. They commit more crime, period, right, over the course of both being pretrial and also after their case is finished.
I remember reading something about that. It was related to something like if a young person got in trouble for something and ended up in the back of a police car, just that one thing alone, being in the back of a police car, would create an environment where that person was more likely to commit future crimes just because of that experience. I don't know if there's any data to back that up, but I remember thinking that was an interesting point.
Well, I can tell you, we ran the data statewide in Kentucky on this question, and we found we used the risk tool we built, and so we were able to identify, okay, who's low, moderate, and high risk. And then after running it, we looked at, okay, what happens when you're detained for more than 24 hours? And the study is available online on the Arnold Foundation website, but it's pretty devastating to see like the rates of recidivism of people committing future crimes go up so much when people are incarcerated. And if you and I think about it, I mean, look, for a lot of people, a lot of us, like, we work paycheck to paycheck. You're sort of like, it's not the most stable environment. And so if you get taken out of that environment, you could lose a job. You could be unable to pay for your apartment. Your kids are, not being picked up from school or there's just so many things that I think can destabilize someone's life so quickly. And I think incarceration is one of them. And it's a really important decision of when you take away someone's liberty before they've been convicted of a crime, that I think we've been pretty quick with bail just to say, $1,000 and, we'll see you when we see you in a few months.
Focusing on young people particularly, do you see how all of the data that you now have, that you've researched, the way you're thinking about this, do you see any way that this could help give advice to young people as to how to stay out of trouble in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, so can I first give you a data answer?
Yes,
and then
please.
I'll give you, okay. By the way, most people, when I talk about data so much, they're like, can you please talk about something else? So
actually,
you're the best, Gregg.
I get excited about it. So I hope our listeners are the same.
I hope so. So one of the projects I did when I was at Arnold was I was really interested in a number of questions related to Camden. As crime went down, there were still a number of challenges around health and education, and there were still crime challenges, of course. And so I went back and spent time with a guy named Jeff Brenner, who was running the Camden Coalition for Healthcare Providers. And Jeff was operating one of the healthcare information exchanges. And so he had the data from the hospital. There are 3 hospitals in Camden. Jeff had essentially combined the data from the 3 hospitals, so he was able to track people's lives, and he was doing it really to target super utilizers, the people who come back frequently into the criminal justice system. And so I went down to see him and talk about, okay, let's do a project together. And the current police chief, who's someone I hired when I was running the police department, he actually dropped me off, and then he stayed for the meeting. And what I realized in about 10 meetings is that Jeff and Scott Thompson knew all the same people. They just knew all the same families. And it sort of strikes you, right, that there's this overlap. And so we decided to push all the criminal justice data into the healthcare data. And we did this project, and Jeff's team ran this amazing study. And we found that there was a 67% overlap of high users of the criminal justice system and the healthcare system. And when you really drill into that, we found that the rates of prevalence of mental illness, substance abuse, and homelessness were just off the charts. We also found, and I will say this, and I think it's one of the, I actually worry that we're failing on a lot of things right now. And part of it comes from the fact that when we looked deeper in the healthcare system and we looked deeper in the criminal justice system, we found that none of the underlying drivers of crime were ever being addressed. And so the fact that people were coming back again and again was not surprising. But now to your question about youth and kids, I'm going to give you an example from that project, so we found this thing where truancy in New Jersey, I think it's 20 or 25 unexplained absences, and a kid can be charged with a crime, essentially for not being in school, which does seem a little counterintuitive because what we really want is them in school and not jail. But that's the way the law works in New Jersey and a lot of other states. And so we looked at, and one of the things we did with this data is we grouped people together. We were able to group people together by family. And so it wasn't just, we were looking at, John Smith's data. We were also looking at John Smith's mother's data. And what we found in a number of instances was that kids who were being found truant, that, for example, their moms were in the ER the week that the kids missed school. And if you think about it, it just turns on our head so much of the way that we see the criminal justice system, right? We're in our own silo. We have no idea what's happening in the healthcare space. The healthcare space has no idea what's happening in the criminal justice space in America. And we sort of have made this decision. And look, I ran juvenile justice, right? And we were putting kids in thinking that they had some form of agency. Like they were making these decisions not to go to school, right? They didn't want to, they were hanging out with kids, right, who were causing trouble. And then you pull this data and you see, my God, like this is such a fixable problem. There's some nurse in some hospital who sees the kids there with the mom, probably gives them juice and cookies, but doesn't actually do the next thing, which is the most important thing. And I'm not saying it's the nurse's responsibility, but someone needs to say, how do we actually keep this family together? Like, how do we keep the kids going to school? And so I've walked away from that experience. And I'm doing a lot of work on, how do we divert people from the criminal justice system?
What a great example. Thank you for sharing. That's amazing.
Yeah, it just really changes the way I think we see the world. I think that there is data work to be done here, which is to basically say, if we looked at people as people and not as individual cases in specific silos, but if we looked at you as people and all the government systems you cross, what services should we be providing that are positive, that could help your kids stay in school, that could help, someone deal with a chronic, whether it's an addiction or mental illness or a health problem. And I don't think we've started to actually understand how we would have a different conversation. And part of it is that if you and I think about the criminal justice reform bill or the education bill, all we think about are the institutions. We don't think about the people. Right. And the people touch multiple institutions. And so to the extent our data is still siloed and we don't think about, okay, how do we think about families and people and communities, and how do we move upstream to try to do this? I don't think we'll be successful. We may let more people out of jail. We may do a lot of things that I think matter enormously, but I now believe that we can dramatically reduce crime in my lifetime, which, 10 years ago, I would not have told you.
So we have this tradition on the Q Factor. Don't worry, it's not too scary. We call it the 3 Qs. Okay. These are 3 questions we ask every guest, no matter what their background or expertise.
Okay.
And the first one is, if you could think outside the realm of criminal justice,
Yeah.
Where do you see big data having the biggest positive impact on the world over the next 10 years? It could be anything: science, manufacturing, philanthropy, healthcare, climate change. You pick it. Anything that comes to mind?
I would say healthcare. I mean, I'm pretty obsessed with the work that's happening now in healthcare, and the way, I mean, just to draw a quick parallel, like, healthcare now having electronic health records, having this unbelievable amount of data that folks are now being able to use to think about, how do we cure cancer? How do we think about solving other problems? And just the way people are starting to use it and how much that's accelerating is really, it's so inspiring to me.
Yeah, that is an important area for sure, all over the world. So second question, on the flip side, is what aspect of the world do you see as being perhaps threatened by big data over the next 10 years?
Well, I mean, I think there's sort of two things I would say. I mean, I do worry about the privacy and the bias questions. And, I really think that we are failing by not having those conversations. And so, for example, in criminal justice, half the space says, yes, we need to use more data and information because it's not good to make important decisions without data and information. And then the other half of the space says we should never use data. There are privacy and bias concerns. And I think the conversation we really should be having is, okay, we live in a world with data. We're going to use it. What should we use? What's okay to use? How should we use it? And what's not okay? And how do we protect people? And so I think that, that is sort of at the top of my list of things I worry about. I also have been to a number of technology meetings and events, and I do think that automation is going to change the world of work, and it's already changed it. I think one of the things, when we sit and we read the paper, we see a story here and there, but I was at an operations research conference, and literally every nominee to win the award for the best innovation was an automation concept that would essentially eliminate jobs and workers, or dramatically change what those jobs look like. And so it's already happening. And I do worry that we're not thinking enough about, look, we want to make improvements, but we want to innovate, but we also have to think about, how do we train our workforce to be like, how do we build a really modern workforce that we can make the most of this and people can have jobs and livelihoods with it.
Yeah, that actually would have been my third question, which is, this idea of artificial intelligence. Do you see it as a friend or a foe to all of us?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. It's both. And again, like, this is the conversation, which is what do we do and how do we do it? And by the way, I thought you were going to ask me Beatles versus Rolling Stones.
Well, that's easy. Beatles.
Totally. I'm with you. I once saw a politician refuse to answer it, and I was like, oh, no, everyone has a bet on that one.
Absolutely. That's an easy one for me.
I'm with you. Me too.
The issue of artificial intelligence and automation, and I think, the idea of we need an industrial policy, plan of what are our future jobs going to be, and how do we train everyone in the world, or in the U.S. for sure? How do we train for those jobs in the future if we are going to, automate the heck out of everything? These are big questions and important ones.
I think so too. I very much agree.
Well, Anne, I can't thank you enough for being here with us today. I'm excited for our follow-up together.
Me too. Thank you so much. I'm excited for everything you're doing.
So that was my conversation with Anne Milgram. What an amazing perspective on such a critical issue. As always, I'd love it if you'd spread the word about the Q Factor. Subscribe and give us a positive rating. That really helps generate visibility for the show and more word of mouth. Thanks again for tuning in. I'm Gregg Fisher. We have some amazing guests lined up for 2019. See you next time.
Gregg Fisher is Portfolio Manager and Head of Research at Gerstein Fisher, a division of People's United Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor and a wholly owned subsidiary of People's United Bank, N.A. Economic and market views and forecasts stated by Mr. Fisher are current as of the date of this podcast and are subject to change without notice. Mr. Fisher is not soliciting any action based on this material. It is for general informational purposes only. The views of the guests that appear on the Q Factor are their own and may not reflect the views of Mr. Fisher or Gerstein Fisher.